This conference will now be recorded.
Okay, so uh, let's see, how should we start this? The purpose of last week's class, if you remember it, was, at least the structure of it, was that we would take sort of a general problem that you find in ethics and use a particular test case to exemplify it, I guess. And of course, the specific situation, the test case, you might say, or the case in point that we talked about last week was, the situation where you might be, I guess, come under the opportunity to say a lie or tell a lie, or at least not to reveal the truth, because you have a sort of dilemma. In other words, you have sort of conflicting responsibilities. And that was a test case for the general problem, which is that sometimes, or really often, I would say, some people would say almost all the time, when making ethical decisions, you have a lot of these dilemmas or these conflicts that come up because you have different responsibilities in your life, morally speaking. And sometimes it seems as if those two things conflict with each other. Different responsibilities do. So for instance, you have a responsibility to, say, protect your children, but sometimes, if, say, one child is doing something wrong, you might have a situation where you might need to protect someone else against that child. There's types of situations where I guess the general principle from which we I guess get the instructions for our lives in specific situations, it doesn't always hold as, I guess, well, I guess the wrong way to say it is that the universal principle isn't actually universal. That's the wrong way, that it doesn't apply to every case. Really, the fact is some cases show that we don't have the right principle in mind. I think that's really what the thing is. And I know that might be confusing, especially if you didn't hear if you weren't there for the whole lesson last week. And that's why we're, of course, doing this a little earlier today so that we can have it all done at the same time. But I want to sort of use the same type of structure today, which is illustrating a general issue or point in ethics and using, at some point anyway, a specific issue to illustrate it, a case in point, you might say. Now, there's a type of ethics called virtue ethics, and it really is. I think it was my first real exposure to studying ethics was through this type of mindset. The basic idea is, well, we talked about virtue before, and I want to talk about it a lot more now. Now, basically, what virtue means is, well, it has a lot of different meanings, but the first one that I might think of is excellence, right? Is that your computer? Does it matter? Okay. The Latin word vir is the root word for virtue, and vir actually just means man. So it's really interesting. I think what is being said by virtue is the full potential of what a human being can be. That's essentially the idea. Now, the thing about that, if that's the case, is that virtue doesn't always have to do with morality, right? I think there are qualities that show a human being to be excellent, but it's not something that is required for him to be moral. So, for instance, we did mention under the, I guess, the form beauty, there is this principle or this virtue that comes from the form of beauty, and that is, say, creativity. That's a virtue, right? So if someone's creative, we could say that is an aspect of that person which shows his particular excellence, his or her particular excellence in that field. In this case, would be creativity. But the thing is, there's nothing really immoral about not being creative. At least I hope not, because then I might go to hell. And a lot of us might too. Anyway, there are some things that fall under virtue that don't necessarily fall under morality. That's essentially what I'm saying. And yet, everything that does fall under morality would fall under the field of virtue. So that's basically what it means, and it's really an important word. Now, the idea of well, okay, I'm gonna say I'll spout out a virtue that is not really commonly talked about. Which, by the way, this is another reason why I really like talking about virtue and looking at ethics from a virtue perspective, because it helps us to think about a lot of different qualities that might be good in a person that we don't often talk about. So I'm curious as to your reaction to this particular virtue. manliness. What are your thoughts when I say that word, manliness? What's the first thing that comes to your mind?
I feel like the term manliness has been around so long that it's its own incident. That what people conceive as manliness and the way that it was defined in the classics are almost opposites. Because we think of manliness as brutish,
Right.
but that's the opposite of what it meant.
That was your first thought? Wow. Very good. Yeah,
Well, I thought about it before.
Okay. Anyone else, though? How about some more tame, less esoteric first thoughts on manliness? I guess you could say, what is the common reaction to the term? Yeah, okay, he's putting his arms up. He's making, all right, you're, I guess, a macho man, right? You're someone, I guess brutish is sort of the term. It's sort of an animalistic type of idea in a sense. There's not really much up here, but, you've got some physical capabilities, right? So, for instance, if you think of, I guess, the images of manliness, it's funny how it's also used by men as sort of a joking way. So, for instance, the guy, he talks about his man cave, right? You hear man cave, and really what you usually think of is, okay, he's got a TV and a lazy boy and beer, and he watches football. That's a man cave, and it's like, okay, well, that's one of the images of man. It's really not the best image I could think of. Now, if you want to see real man caves, look at what Theodore Roosevelt's personal quarters used to look like. That is awesome. I mean, he's got animal heads all over the place and books.
I used to read this blog called Saving the Study, which brings back the old school, like everything is wood, which is my dream. Wood and leather, an entire room of wood and leather with some stone accents.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
If you look up the blog, which by the way, young guys especially, well, old guys too, but young guys especially, there's a really excellent blog called The Art of Manliness online. Brett McKay is the guy that runs this. There's actually an article, I think, that has, 10 different, famous man caves of history. Really great inspiration for that. But it's a really excellent blog on manliness. And anyway, these common first assumptions, even, it's very brutish. It's actually not seen as a virtue at all. It's really seen as a vice. That's how the word is used. Now, and this is the avenue through which the virtue ethics can take us, which is talking about things that we never have really talked about or thought about too much before, at least not in recent years. So that's the key. Quentin mentioned it. Really, if you start in say before 1940 or 1930 and go all the way back to like the beginning of literature, manliness is always used as a really, really common virtue. As a matter of fact, look at the Declaration of Independence, and you will find the term in there used as a virtue, which I thought was really cool. I never had noticed that before. But read, it's a short document. Read the Declaration of Independence, and you'll notice the idea of manliness is mentioned as a virtue. So, okay, Quentin, can you, if you're not too distracted, tell me then what would be the more classic definition of it then? If it's not brutishness.
So, well, and maybe this is my bias, because these are the kind of things that appeal to me. It's like the classical definition of a polymath.
Mm-hmm.
So Da Vinci was kind of looked at as one of the main manly men. So manliness in his terms had to do with some degree of excellence, although not perfection, in athletics, intellect,
morality.
Well, I was going to say morality, and then fellowship. Art was another one.
Right.
Art's usually what he's remembered for, but that was actually a minor thing that he did compared to the rest of his things.
Yeah, I would say that art, in this Leonardo da Vinci's case, was actually sort of a manifestation of all his other qualities. Like if you see everything else that he was able to study and things he knew about, they sort of showed themselves in his art. That was sort of how we communicated them to the larger world. That's how we come up against them too, from studying him historically, by the way. But anyway, you've heard the term the Renaissance man. Of course, this is really one of the first Renaissance men was Leonardo da Vinci. this, guy in the Renaissance period, which means rebirth, right? It was sort of the rebirth of a lot of different things in art and the rest of the culture that, at least they say, during the Middle Ages wasn't so much there. And I actually think, and C.S. Lewis thinks this as well, interestingly, that it's sort of a made-up period. It's not really a thing that actually happened. It's just when all those things sort of started to come to fruition. That's kind of how I see it too. Because it's not like people weren't interested in the classics and medieval period. Matter of fact, that's where we get our texts from, all the old books like Plato and Aristotle and stuff, and like Heraclitus and any of the other fragments that we have. I mean, stuff that there's really no reason why we should still have all of this stuff. It actually was recorded and preserved by the Christian church in the medieval times and before. Really amazing. And it started to be studied as you go on. And basically, the ideal of the Renaissance man was somebody who was, you might say, the quintessential man. And he had it all down, And you can still see images of that, sort of positive images, somewhat skewed a little bit. The first one I would think of is, say, like James Bond. He's smart. He's obviously got a real high IQ. He's really, obviously, very handsome. He's very physically, I guess, adept at, accomplishing things he needs to. He's kind of got it all down. He's also got a lot of style, right? So he does really cool things, and he looks cool while doing them. And so, at some level, I think he's kind of a little bit skewed. There's the moral aspect is really there with him particularly. But yeah, the idea of virtue and manliness are actually pretty infused. As a matter of fact, like I said, vir means man. And that's a really important point, and it's the idea that virtue is the domain of human beings. And animals can't really achieve that, right? And they can do things that we might say, well, that dog, attacked that, or tore up that attacker, and we can say that the dog showed courage. We can apply those types of virtues to animals, and we can, of course, think of God as expounding those or exuding those, as well. But particularly Aristotle thought that virtue is really the domain of human beings. And I think it's a really interesting idea. And I have a quote from him in here. I wanted to look for it. I'm not sure which one it is. I actually want to read through a few quotes that have to do with virtue and ethics in general, but virtue in particular from Aristotle. I wanted to show you something too. This is really, a good idea. During this class, I hope to show just some, as I hopefully have been, some, practical things that I do to kind of help me think about these things and implement them in my life as well. And now there's one old practice that has come out of use in recent years, and that's the what's called a commonplace book. Now, what it is essentially is that you, as you study and read things about, say, different subjects, when you find, say, a quote in a book that is especially important to you or really shows how you feel about a certain subject, you write it down. And so a lot of people throughout history, you can think of, I think Thomas Jefferson, for instance, had a commonplace book. John Adams did too, actually. I think all the founding fathers did. Erasmus had one, by the way. I think he was one of the first people to really make it popular. But
I think you're right about that.
Yeah, well, the idea is you can conglomerate for yourself all of the things from what you've read and all, the most important things of what you've learned from books, and you put it down in, say, a notebook. So, I started doing it a few years ago, and I have kind of expanded to like volume 6 by now. And they're not completed, but I started to put them in different categories so I could kind of, I guess, shape them that way. Now, I have one on morality. And I was thinking, I was reading through these as I was, of course, getting ready for this class, and I thought, a lot of these quotes are really good, and you can't really say it too much better. Now, the funny thing I found, though, was that I have one that's, I didn't think about it till recently, but I have one that's labeled morality and another one that's labeled ethics. And I thought about it, and I was like, what has been my distinction between the two? Now, remember, Quentin mentioned last week, at least he mentioned to me, and I said that there is an important distinction between human systems of ethics, right? Like rules for doctors or rules for, what else? I guess laws of the road.
So ours comes up a lot because it affects the interaction between two different groups of people. But
right.
Attorneys have their own ethics.
Right.
I guess the police force has an extra set of ethics.
That's true. I guess even ministers to some degree have some sort of legal requirements or prohibitions as well. Like, for instance, if you come to me and if you come to me in my office and actually, confide in me and tell me I'm legally not allowed to tell anyone about it, like even my wife, or maybe this is something I've thought about. I'm not sure about elders. Is there anyone that knows the answer to this question too? is if you're allowed to communicate certain things with elders, if that's actually legal. Obviously, it's moral. I think it's actually required. It's kind of what you should do. But it's funny, anyway, a lot of ethical systems aren't necessarily the same as morality. For instance, a doctor who's unattached otherwise, having a relationship with his, let's say, a patient, it's not immoral in itself, but it's, it's against the rules and it's unethical. So, that's really the difference. Or like the other illustration I used, when I was in school, we actually weren't allowed to wear shorts. Now, obviously, wearing shorts to some degree isn't immoral, but, obviously it was a rule there. So anyway, ethical systems as opposed to morality. Now, the way I situated it here in this case was morality as ethics acted out in your life. Ethics more as the intellectual side of it, the thoughts surrounding morality. That's kind of how I situated these things. Now I thought about a few things, and this is kind of be scattered, as I probably already have been during this entire few lessons anyway. But hopefully you're still getting something out of it, even if the organization isn't, I guess, what it ought to be. But I was thinking, the first quote I have here is from Epictetus, which was another Greek philosopher, and he said something really interesting. This is an interesting thing about morality, about how the ideas of virtue and ethics manifest themselves in your life. And he said, it is difficulties that show what men are. And I was thinking about that because specifically in this verse in Hebrews, if you remember, it even said that Jesus was made perfect through suffering. And that was a strange idea to me at first, because it's like, well, he's already perfect, right? He never sinned. And that's definitely true. I think there's a distinction that needs to be made between being sinless and being perfect in the sense of having your destiny and potential completed. There's a difference between being what you are and manifesting what you are. I think that's the point here. And Epictetus says, and as a matter of fact, the New Testament teaches, that it is difficulties actually which show what you're made of. And this is really an important idea for morality and for showing the virtue that's inside of you, is it doesn't really come out. And as a matter of fact, I don't think you know that you actually have it until you come up against difficulties, until, in essence, the virtue is tested. You as a person are tested. I think that's exactly why James says in James 1, count it all joy when you face trials of various kinds, knowing that the trying of your faith produces steadfastness. And he says, let steadfastness have this, I guess, was it perfect work in you, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. So there's that idea that you really don't know who and what you are until you come up against some sort of test. And that's an important thing to think about ahead of time. Like younger people especially, we don't really even come up compared to a lot of other people, and depending on if your situation's fairly normal or maybe fairly domestic, you don't really come up against a whole lot of trials early on in your life, right? But, for instance, would you say that you are, generally speaking, a good person?
Yeah.
Right. And the other thing is, not to contradict you and say you're a bad person, I have no idea. But the fact is, you don't know whether or not you're good until you can test it. And what did David say in the Psalms? Psalm 14, what did God look down from heaven and what did he find? Wasn't rhetorical. Your Bibles, don't you? Psalm 14. Want me to tell you? He said, there is none that doeth good. No, not one. Now that's a hard realization. I mean, we say the same thing from Romans 3:23, all have sinned. I mean, that's easy enough. But that's the idea of all have fallen short. All are trying to do good, but everyone at some point has failed. David's saying something a little bit different. He said, nobody does good. And that's kind of a hard thing to swallow, isn't it? The idea that really none of us are good. Now there's a difference between being virtuous and being merely untested, I suppose, or being sheltered, perhaps, right? So, for instance, we don't call a let's see, let me think of an example of this. A heroism, for instance, or self-sacrifice and courage that go into, say, giving your life for a comrade in war, let's say, right? So if there's a man who knows that one of his friends is about to be shot and he jumps in front of him or tries to save him, he's killed in the process. I mean, we call that guy a hero. I mean, he gave up his life for his friend. And apparently, Jesus said that, or Paul said that there is no greater love than that. Now, we would call him a hero, but the thing is that he did that on purpose, right? Now, let's say he just happened to be walking in front of his comrade when the enemy shoots and he gets killed. Obviously, it doesn't make him a bad person, but it doesn't make him a hero because he didn't mean to give his life, right? So, there's a difference here. I think there's a really special thing about the trials that do come your way and how you react to them, which shows whether or not you actually are good and whether or not you have that virtue. That's really important. Someone we might say who, there are a lot of people would say he's very pure, he's very chaste. He doesn't really go around and he doesn't fool around and that sort of thing. And the fact is, it might be so that he's actually chaste, but the thing is, maybe he's just afraid to talk to women, And that's something that we need to think about. There's a difference between being virtuous and just being weak or being incapable of committing evil. And I always, when I first thought about, I thought about this quote for a long time, and it came together for me. I understood it eventually when I started, studying these things. It's from kind of maybe I shouldn't mention this. People always laugh at me when I say I like this. But you ever heard of the Anne of Green Gables book and movie? Really great movie, actually. The Megan Follows version of it is a really great movie. Anyway, this is where I first came up against it because I still haven't actually read the book. But I remember Marilla is talking to Anne, and they're in the field, I think, walking home, and they're talking about who was it? I think it wasn't Gilbert. They were talking about someone else, like some other person in school, and Anne said, "Well, he's just so terribly good," and Marilla said, "Well, what? That's a bad thing? You mean you want to be married to a wicked man?" She says, "No, I don't think I like him to be wicked. I think I'd like him to be able to be, but wouldn't." And that's a really interesting idea, though, the idea that you have the power to do bad things, but you don't do them. That's virtue. That's power, really. It's the idea of, what was it? I remember from Schindler's List movie when, what's his name, Oscar, Liam Neeson, he goes to the guy in charge of the concentration camp, and he tells him the story. This guy was awful, right? He kills everyone for no reason whatsoever. With the slightest infraction of a rule or a mistake, he kills them. And he says, there's this guy who's a thief, and he runs away, and he's caught, and he's brought to the king, and he knows, he's going to die. He's guilty, and yet he begs the king to forgive him, but he knows he's going to die. But the king pardons him. He said, that is power. When you have the ability to do something and the justification for it, but you show mercy instead. You do something which isn't reactionary, but it is of your own accord. It's of your own decision, your own free will. That's what morality is. That's what virtue is. It's a really amazing idea, and that's the thing about the people that we have, in a sense, worshipped, or I guess lauded and revered throughout history, are people who had power but didn't use it for evil. And as a matter of fact, that is exactly the idea behind meekness, the meekness of Christ. And when Jesus said, "Blessed are the meek, they will inherit the earth." The idea is, and I heard Jordan Peterson say it exactly this way. I don't know where he got it from. It wasn't his original creation, but that's where I heard the quote from. The idea of meekness isn't being weak. The idea is essentially, you're the only guy in the room who's got a sword, but you keep it in the sheath. Or we might say, in other words, you're the only guy in the room who's got a gun, and you keep it in holster. It's a really, really powerful idea. You have ability. You could do what you wanted. You could manipulate things in your environment to be the way you want to, even at the expense of other people. You can do that, and there's no really adverse consequences for you if you do, but you choose not to do so. That's different than being weak, not being able to do something. The guy who, he would never hurt a fly. Well, maybe he could never hurt a fly, and that's not virtue. And I think that's an idea also, if you connect that with the idea of manliness. That is essentially the underlying thing. Is there is some sort of, you might say, biological or physical foundation to it. There's the hard part of, or I guess the solid part of being a man. There's the masculinity aspect, which in our culture we're actually afraid of in our culture right now. Really, that's what's happening with this whole anti-masculinity type of idea. It's not that we hate it so much, we think it evil. Is we're scared of it because it is the vehicle for power in the world and has been throughout history. We are scared to death of that, and we ought to be. Because you can see how people have misused it. So what is our response? We say, well, get rid of it. Tell our boys not to be violent. Don't let them play with guns and toy guns and that sort of thing, and try to get rid of any sort of natural impulse as much as we can to get rid of this inherent, I guess, capacity for violence. And that's the wrong answer because it's there naturally. The idea is, and the goal should be, not to get rid of the abilities, but to point the abilities towards things which are good. Now, I was thinking about this in terms of the King Arthur stories. I've always loved reading the King Arthur stories, especially ones from Howard Pyle. By the way, if you ever want to read them, especially to your kids, get Howard Pyle's versions and not say like Thomas Mallory or any of the others. He was a Christian, and he really kind of he made the stories have a moral for children, especially. He made the guys into role models because they weren't always very good people in the original stories. But in this one, they really were, and I really love how they acted, and historically too, what the idea behind, say, chivalry for knights was. Because the thing is, and if you go back to this, really has its roots somewhat in Thomas Aquinas, the Catholic theologian in the medieval ages. The problem was that you had these very powerful men, knights and lords, and they could just do whatever they wanted in Europe, and they were fighting each other, and it was really rough. And by the way, it was one of the reasons why the First Crusade happened. That's because we needed a common enemy to fight instead of killing each other. On a spiritual level, it might be a good idea for the church to start thinking in that terms as well. We have an enemy to fight, of course, but as some of us were talking about before, sometimes we focused on fighting each other. Anyway, these guys had, the idea of chivalry was originally a very, like I said, the basis of chivalry was very, I guess, biological and physical. Really, chivalry is an idea that goes down to horsemanship. That's what it meant originally was, well, you can do well fighting on a horse. That's essentially what it meant. But people like Aquinas and other Christians wanted to sort of change the way it was viewed. The idea was that you are someone who's you're the most powerful people in our society. You should submit yourself to something higher than you. And in this case, it was to Christ. And do the thing that you do, not for evil, but for good. So that was the idea. It wasn't so much, get rid of your abilities. It was use them for something productive. I think that's the idea of virtue, and for practical application to us, that's exactly the type of things we should be teaching our kids. Not to be undangerous, I mean, that's the thing is, thinking about God, he's very dangerous, very powerful. The first aspect of a relationship with God seems to me to be fear. But the thing is, we understand that God is being perfect. He uses his ultimate power for good, always. He does not do it for evil. We would say it's against his nature. So that's something we try to emulate in ourselves. The idea of virtue doesn't mean you make yourself weak. It means you make yourself strong, and you only use your strengths for good. Go ahead.
Could it be viewed as somebody with power being not using their power influence for selfish reasons, but for selfless reasons?
Right, exactly. In the first volume of Howard Pyle's King Arthur books, there's this, when the round table is established, they have this code of honor that all the knights have to recite and promise. It's an oath before you can sit down at the round table. And it was basically, I will be gentle to the weak, courageous to the strong, terrible to the wicked. I will, basically, I'll help the people that need help, and I'll kind of serve those who are under me. It's really interesting, especially in the medieval mindset, where you have people that are, they're nobles and they're peasants and serfs, and yet the nobles act as if they're the serfs. That's exactly the application of Christ's idea, right? The first will be last and last will be first. Even God came down from heaven, not for his own purposes, essentially, but really to be a servant. And that's a really amazing idea for someone who's in power. And it has really affected, if you look at it, this is something we implicitly believe. It's not hard to convince a Western person to believe this idea. What do we call the people that are basically in charge of us and make our rules and enforce the rules? We call them public servants. I mean, go back to, say, medieval India. You don't find people called public servants there. These are kings. These are people that are rulers, even lords of gods. We don't have that idea here. It's because of that, I think, the Christian ethic, which has infused itself into the culture of the world, specifically Western culture, that we understand that idea, that meekness is the person who's the only one in the room that has the sword and he keeps it in his sheath. And like you were saying, in using those powers not for selfish reasons but for selfless ones, making it outward focused. The other idea, interestingly, behind the chivalric idea, that code of honor, I always puzzled over this because there are pretty general things in that code of honor I mentioned. Be gentle unto the weak, courageous unto the strong, terrible unto the wicked, and it mentioned I will hold all women as sacred. that was a really strange idea to me. I was thinking, why that? That's kind of weird. I think thinking about it, well, one of the issues, if you look historically, of knights also was when they would say raid and pillage and plunder, they would also rape. And the idea, I think, that the Christian monks tried to infuse in there was that the same thing. You have the ability to do something, and yet, you know, I think you have a responsibility to do something else. So that idea was infused in there specifically because that was a real issue with men of war, was that you hold women who were at this, in, you know, in that society at the time, the weakest physically speaking, and financially speaking, and all the other things, you know, the weakest element to that society. And so you honor the weakest element. You even see it as sacred, as special, as something that you treat as if is the most important and most powerful. That's a really beautiful and amazing idea. Now, I want to read this quote too. This was from one of Plato's lesser known books called Laws. It's the, by the way, when we start, I don't know, did you mention the books?
Yeah, I talked about it.
Yeah, well, Quentin mentioned maybe a few like classes that we'll just kind of post online on the classics of Western culture.
We're gonna let them participate in that one.
Oh, okay, yeah.
We'll pick a day we're gonna do it, and
Sure.
I'll let everybody know.
Right. Well, in the so I've read through Plato's already, which I'll do again when we read them. But I'm going to warn you about Laws. That's the longest one, and it is dry. I mean, it's some rough stuff to get through, man. I'll tell you what. It's not one of his most famous dialogues, that's for sure. There's a reason why. But I found this quote, which is just awesome, and it's regarding morality. It's kind of long, so I'll just read it here. Now, here's what he says: of all the things which a man has next to the gods, his soul is the most divine and most truly his own. Wherefore I am right in bidding everyone next to the gods to honor his own soul, which everyone seems to honor, but no one honors as he ought. For honor is a divine good, and no evil thing is honorable. And he who thinks that he can honor the soul by word or gift or any sort of compliance without making her in any way better, seems to honor her, but honors her not at all. For example, every man from his very boyhood fancies that he is able to know everything, and thinks that he honors his soul by praising her, and he is very ready to let her do as she may like. But I mean to say that in acting thus he injures his soul, and is far from honoring her, whereas in our opinion, he ought to honor her as second only to the gods. Again, when a man thinks that others are to be blamed and not himself for the errors which he has committed from time to time, and the many and great evils which befell him in consequence, and is always fancying himself to be exempt and innocent, he is under the idea that he's honoring his soul, whereas the very reverse is the fact, for he is really injuring her. And when, disregarding the word and approval of the legislator, this is the lawgiver in the context that he's talking about, he indulges in pleasure, then again he is far from honoring her. He only dishonors her, that is his soul, and fills her full of evil and remorse. Or when he does not endure to the end the labors and fears and sorrows and pains which the legislator approves, but gives way before them, then by yielding he does not honor the soul, but by all such conduct he makes her to be dishonorable. Nor when he thinks that life at any price is a good, does he honor her, but yet once more he dishonors her. For the soul, having a notion that the world below is all evil, he yields to her, and does not resist and teach or convince her that for aught she knows, the world of the gods below, instead of being evil, may be the greatest of all goods. Again, when anyone prefers beauty to virtue, what is this but the real and utter dishonor of the soul? For such a preference implies that the body is more honorable than the soul, and this is false, for there is nothing of earthly birth which is more honorable than the heavenly. And he who thinks otherwise of the soul has no idea how greatly he undervalues this wonderful possession. Nor again, when a person is willing or not unwilling to acquire dishonest gains, does he then honor his soul with gifts. Far otherwise, he sells her glory and honor for a small piece of gold. But all the gold which is under or upon the earth is not enough to give in exchange for virtue. Or in other words, as we've heard in another place, what does it profit a man if he gains the whole world and loses himself, loses his soul? Really interesting idea here regarding virtue too, which is that if you're the goal here is honoring the self in a sense, honoring your soul, which is an interesting idea. You know, we mentioned being selfless, and in a sense that's definitely true. But in doing good things, one person once, a friend of mine pointed out to me, we really all are looking to ourselves in some sense, right? I mean, you're doing it not just for the well-being of others. When you do a good deed, let's say, you're also doing it for the well-being of your own soul. And that's a wholesome type of, I guess, not selfishness, but it's a wholesome focus on the self. But sometimes, as Plato says, there are things that you do that you might think are honorable to yourself. Like he mentions justifying yourself when you make a mistake. Say, oh no, it was someone else's fault that happened. It wasn't really my fault. You might think you're defending yourself, and that's good for you. It's sort of this spiritual self-preservation. He says what you're actually doing is dishonoring her. Because the honorable thing to do for your soul, what's good for her, or using the feminine for the soul here, what's good for your soul is really to own up to your mistakes and face them, and try to, in a sense, change the way that you operate in the soul. What was it? Giving word or gift to yourself, or any sort of compliance without making yourself in any way better isn't actually good for you at all. So the idea here behind virtue is that you're striving towards something, right? As I see it, excellence, the idea of virtue is you're shooting upwards. You're going, the image is you're going towards the star, right? You're reaching for the highest goal that you can possibly attain to. And so it's in that sense also, it's a positive goal. It's not just a matter of not doing evil things, right? It's not just a matter of, refraining from doing bad things. It's actively seeking the good. Yeah, go ahead. Did you have your hand up?
No, sorry.
Oh, okay. Never mind. Yeah, go ahead.
First off, the reason it's always her is suke is feminine. So it's just good English.
Right, that's okay. Good translation. Right, it's a good translation.
I think part of that, though, also is who yourself belongs to.
Mm.
Because whenever we do good, and if our self belongs to God, then the glory goes to God.
Right.
Even though it's us doing it, and in a way we're glorifying self, but when your self is no longer yours,
right,
then the glory goes to God.
Yeah. Well, this it makes me think of a really interesting, complicated idea about what the self actually is, right? Now, and I'm thinking in terms of Carl Jung, which is maybe not a good rabbit hole to go down right now, but the basic idea behind us is that we aren't really complete selves right now in our current form at all. And only when we, I guess, achieve that union with God in the end, as that union is consummated in the end, will we actually be complete and whole. I mean, that's an easy enough idea for Christians to swallow. I mean, we understand that pretty well. Our perfection is in, I guess it's in the, as Bonhoeffer says, it's in the penultimate stage. Penultimate means that which comes before the last. And so we are saved, but we're still in this, you might say, second to last stage, where we're for us in time, we're in the process of being perfected, but for God, it is essentially the work has occurred, it will be consummated at one point. So, or at a point in time, or at the ending of time. So, but anyway, so we can understand that. The idea behind self is that Jung goes to it sort of from the point of the unconscious self, the part of us that we really aren't aware of at all, because you have these motivations and archetypes and ideas that come to you, and you have no idea where they come from, right? I mean, have you ever heard even the term, the idea has come to me? Oh, the idea just came to me. That's a really stupid way to say that, isn't it? But it's the best we can say is, oh, the idea just came to me. Where did it come from? We don't know. A lot of these things, a lot of the stuff that comes up to us. That's why people like the depth psychologists and Jung and those other people who started out in psychoanalysis started moving into that dream and I guess not interpretation, but examining people's dreams. Because the idea was that in the dream, when you're asleep, your unconscious self kind of rises to the front, and a lot of the things that are back there that you're not really conscious of, they start to come out. And they saw that because everyone seemed to have the same types of patterns in their dreams. And incidentally, it was the same, amazingly, it was the same types of patterns that we find in our myths and fairy tales and legends, those types of stories. So there's something definite about the unconscious part of ourselves, of our psyches, that is coming to the fore and is really important in helping us to understand ourselves in a practical everyday sense, but also to understand ourselves in general. And so I think personally, from a Christian perspective, these things ultimately come from God. As far as any good thing that comes to you, every good gift comes from the Father of lights. But I think that that understanding self, when it comes to, say, like honoring yourself, like back to Quentin's point, in other words, when we say that we're doing something and it's kind of good for us, and it's in a sense glorifying to us, since essentially the simplest way to say it, as far as I can tell, is since there is, I guess, God in you, God lives in you. when you do something that's good or glorifying to you in the moral sense, you're actually glorifying God. So the idea is, of course, that the unconscious must become conscious. That's what we're doing in learning anything. There are some things we don't know and we want to become aware of them, right? There are some things we're not aware of and we want to get to know them. That's our goal for almost everything that we do. That is the ultimate goal of creation, it seems to me. And essentially, I think at the bottom of that lies awareness of God and knowing Him. That's in an experiential knowledge. That's essentially our goal. So if that's our goal and that's what we're striving for, then I think we can kind of understand that it's really not, it's like the oracle at Delphi always said, know thyself. It's really not you that you're trying to get to know. It's the divine image that's inside of you, the true self, which unites all of creation and everyone's souls together and creates or unites all of existence and all of reality. So really, in doing these things, it's broader than just what's good for you right now, or even what's good for you long term throughout your life. It's what's glorifying to the image of God who exists inside of each one of you, every human being. But of course, in Christ, it takes on a new meaning, because not only is the image of God in us as creation, in a sense, we're united with Christ as the Spirit lives in us as His particular people. And, that makes it, it kind of adds a whole new dimension to the moral life and to the idea of honoring God through honoring your own soul. Now, I saw your hand up this time for sure.
So it makes sense to me both from a spiritual and a biologic perspective, though, because from the standpoint of, God created our souls. We originally came from God.
Right.
And I think that there's something about that is part of the reason why we seek God. I think that our soul craves the presence of God.
Right.
And I think it is interesting how our soul being created by God, and then when we become Christians, the Holy Spirit dwelling in us, then God dwells with our spirit that came from God.
Right.
And then you wonder why these ideas and thoughts just came to me, or how when God designed us, He designed us to be sentient beings.
Mm-hmm.
We have the ability to make our own choices, have our own thoughts, be independent in existence, just like Him.
Mm-hmm.
He has His own thoughts. He has His own opinions. He is the way He is, and we are the way we are. And His plan would not have worked had we not had the ability to have thoughts of our own that come out of nowhere, that we create on our own to a certain extent when we make those connections based upon, I think, the input from our soul, the input spiritually through providence or through the Holy Spirit or whatever, and just their experience in life. And I think it's a really amazing, mysterious thing that I don't understand at all. But I think it is really, if we really think about how special we are, it's one of those things where I don't think that we really recognize how unique each of us is as a created being and an individual, not just of the flesh. Because we're looking at the flesh and we see all these people and we just forget to appreciate our uniqueness.
Yeah, definitely. Sorry, I heard your mouth open, so I thought you had something to say.
Well, I guess I could say.
Yeah, go ahead.
The God-shaped hole is universal. And even
WHOLE? Hole?
No,
Or hole?
the hole in the ground.
Okay.
The God-shaped hole is universal, and everyone seeks something. Even those who don't believe in God find something to fill that hole.
Right.
I don't find it coincidental that some of the strongest environmentalists are atheists, because they're looking for something to take a round peg in a square hole. But that's what they see, is there's something higher than us. That's the part that God planted in us. And He wants us to define that based upon our experience.
Right. Yeah. It's true. I think, what was it? Every love, in essence, or at bottom, is really love of God, whether the person knows it or not. That's what everyone's really searching for. I mean, that's the thing, we're all searching for something. If you look at even, your individual acts and what you do every day, and ask, why are you doing these things? Like, there's really, with a purely naturalistic and materialistic standpoint, there's absolutely no reason to do almost anything that we do. So I think, implicitly, we all are searching for something, and really the highest form of all those things, the thing that it all is going toward is of course that relationship with God. It's what we all want, whether we're conscious of it or not. And that goes back to your point about, the things that God has infused in us in the beginning. And that's an interesting idea. Plato had an idea that I think connects to that. It's kind of misguided to some degree. There's something missing, but the Christian mindset makes it complete, which is that virtue is something which isn't taught and cannot be. It's something that is remembered from, you might say, a pre-physical past. Plato had this idea, which, by the way, it's interesting because a lot of people and cultures throughout the history of the world have had the same idea, that our souls pre-existed before our bodies did. Interesting idea. Now, we won't get into the discussion today, particularly regarding that. But the idea, as far as he could tell, was, the thing is, we don't really, when we learn something, we're actually remembering something that we knew from the realm of the forms, right? And virtue is something which is inherently infused in us. It's not so much something that we have to acquire and learn over time. And, it's an interesting idea. Now, Aristotle kind of had a little bit of a different twist on that. He said, essentially, we don't have virtue, right when we're born naturally. It is something that you have to learn. What we do have is the natural capacity to obtain. And that at least is definitely true. And it's something that separates us from animals, which is, the ability to, or I guess the idea of oughtness, the moral imperative, the idea of things that you should do as opposed to things that you simply can. And that's a really interesting idea. So virtue is the realm of mankind. That's the idea behind virtue. Of course, it even means man, like we said. And Aristotle said something interesting, too, about how the level of God is sort of above virtue, just as the level of beast is below it. When an animal does something, what we would say wrong, like an animal attacks a child, let's say, we don't think the animal's evil. Now, obviously, we think the animal's, crazy or demented or ratted or whatever it happens to be that caused the animal to do that, or maybe just acting on instinct if it's like a lion, but we don't say, oh, how terrible. We don't take the animal before court and try to, have the family do, the impact statements for the animal that killed their child. It's not, obviously it's not a very, fun thing to think about, but still, it's not really a, there's no, I guess, virtue applied to animals. They're below that. They're on the level of instinct. Now we have those instincts too, right? There's a biological side to us. We have a lot of those same instincts. But the thing which exists and makes us completely and particularly human is that we have that idea of oughtness and moral imperative. And when one of us does something that is wrong, we are brought before a judge and given the impact statements from, say, the family of a victim. And we are told, you've done something not just which has bad consequence or which has destroyed some part of our society. You've done something which is on a spiritual, abstract level actually wrong and reprehensible. And that's a different thing. That's a really interesting thing about human beings. But the thing is, as Aristotle said, God, you might say, is kind of above that as well. Virtue or excellence, which is really how it should be understood, is kind of apart from what God is. If you remember last week, I mentioned that I kind of perceive the forms, the good, the true, and the beautiful, as sort of being the basis for the virtues. Now, I think this is a good illustration for the difference between man and God. Man follows the virtues. God is the form, right? So he is the standard of all those things that we're striving for. So virtue is kind of below him in that sense, right? It doesn't mean he doesn't do good things. What it means is he is goodness itself. Like there's nothing above him that we could use to define what is good. So in that sense, he's sort of above it all. And we mentioned the dilemmas that are kind of inherent for us within that, the fact that we don't really understand God in his fullness as being the unity of all of those good things and true things and beautiful things. We don't see that. What we do see are the imperatives that he gives to us, his will in our lives. And so sometimes it makes it seem as if God sometimes does things which are bad. Like, for instance, a lot of the conflicts we have come up when, say, well, why did God was it right for God to have Abraham sacrifice his son Isaac, let's say? Or was it right for God to allow Job to suffer so much for absolutely no reason whatsoever, as far as we can tell, right? And that's the thing is, as far as we can tell, there doesn't seem to be a lot of reasons to the bad things that happen. And I think the answer to that dilemma is that we aren't able to tell. We're not on the same level of God. We don't understand his ways. Like you said, his ways are far above ours. I think that's one of the most important lessons a human being can take to heart is, and read Romans 9 if you want to talk about that, if you want to look into that a little bit more. The idea that God is sovereign over all, and I guess on some level, the things that he does, I guess you could say we wouldn't have the right or ability or the reason to do. So for instance, it would be really wrong for me to say, all right, guys, we're going to go and or I guess a better example, let's say, is if the state of Israel decided to just rise up and completely wipe out Palestine once and for all. That would be kind of wrong, wouldn't it? Killing, women and children and that sort of thing, just getting them out of our land, right? But isn't that exactly what God had the ancient people of Israel do? So this is, that's a pretty good illustration of the difference between man's place and God's. There is something about God that kind of goes over our moral sensibilities that we don't quite understand. So virtue is specifically the realm of mankind. It's our excellence and the will of God in our lives. What He does in His will, that's something we don't completely know. We do know what's expected of us. And I saw your hand up.
Well, on that point, God had judged the people of that land. It actually withheld the judgment until the evil would be full, as He says, before Israel conquered it. But to the second point is where we get into trouble is when we want to take human attributes and put them on top. We should be putting God's attributes onto ourselves. We're trying to be.
Right.
That we could.
Emulating. Yeah.
But we should be emulating God, not saying, well, God does this and it's wrong. Well, no.
Right.
Whatever God does is always right.
Right, and that's exactly what Paul, when I mentioned Romans 9, that's what Paul says, right? He's like, if God wants to choose Jacob over Esau, who are you to say that it's a wrong decision, right? If God says, I love Jacob, have I loved, Esau have I hated? I chose Jacob through which the Messiah would come, and Esau, and Edom through the kingdom that came from Esau. They did, it didn't really turn out so well for them. And so we might say, well, is God being unjust? It's like, well, who are you to ask the question? Who are you to question that sovereignty? In other words? Right, exactly. That's the point, isn't it? We don't. And we don't have the ability to make those judgments. That would be putting ourselves in God's place. Right.
But I think it does behoove us to familiarize ourselves with a logical argument as to why those things about sovereignty and the all-knowingness of God is, because the skeptic will bring up those examples of, how could you have a loving God when He tells them to kill all the women and children and everybody? Yeah. And so, having an answer to that, having a logical answer to that, I think is important. Having thought about it previously and understanding these are the reasons why this is because this is God's will, He's sovereign, so on and so forth.
Right, definitely, and looking in the big picture, right? Like I guess that's funny. I'll say this: it's only people in at least Christian influenced society would have these types of questions. That's what I think. Because if you look at the other great traditions of history, this question never would have come up. I just finished reading the ancient Hindu text, the Bhagavad Gita, which has, I think it's Krishna, one of the Hindu gods, telling one of the heroes of old to slay all these people. And he's like, well, I don't really want to, a lot of these guys are my brothers and friends, I don't want to kill them. And he basically says, I can see more than you, right? I can see the stories of their lives from beginning to end, and I have a plan that has been set up for them from before the foundation of the world, and you don't see it all. What you need to do is do what I say, because I can see it all. That type of idea, the sovereignty of the gods. Every culture understood that. Nobody had this question, but maybe he did wrong. It's like, gods can't do wrong. That's the idea. And the funny thing is, it's only a Christian that can stand up and actually ask the question. It's a really amazing ability that someone can stand up, a man can stand up and ask the God if he's doing what's actually right. It's something that only could have come through the ethic that Christ teaches of love. It's a really, really interesting thing. It is a dilemma that, like you said, we need to work through. We need to have the reasoning behind. But it's also interesting to note that it's only through belief in Christ and in the ethic of Christ that we can have this discussion in the first place. And that's an amazing thing for the framework for that type of discussion.
Well, I think one of the big things whenever you talk to somebody like that is they see things in absolutes. And that's usually the problems. Like I heard, I've read some things about this, how that Jesus couldn't have been the great Redeemer because He allowed slavery to continue after the New Testament. Okay. Well, in a similar manner, what we see in the conquest of Canaan, if they would have spared the women and children, they would have starved to death, which would have been a much worse way to die than what they ended up happening. So whenever you think, well, it's in this absolute sense, killing someone is always wrong, which is particularly against warfare. It goes beyond that because there's other consequences that you have to deal with beyond that, and that's what God is doing. He is seeing the final, what would have actually happened. Because back then, I'm not saying that in that sense, but they would not have been able to survive the peoples that were around that area because they were wild. And the raping and things that we talked about before with the knights, that's what would have happened to them. So it was showing mercy to kill them.
Well, another way to look at that also in that situation is that, you know, if you spared the women, and tried to assimilate them into your culture, there's a possibility that, you know, like what happened with Solomon, where foreign women caused the corruption of his heart and caused him to worship foreign gods. And you might have had a very similar thing. You would have had the corruption of the nation of Israel as a result of the temple.
There's no question about that. That happened during the wilderness.
Absolutely, there would have been corruption.
It was already happening.
Right.
Right.
So it wasn't just for that reason. I think there were obviously multiple reasons why he felt that, or he knew that was the best way.
Right, and so back to the point of the difference between man and God, I would say that type of situation is something only God can make, because we, by definition, can't see the ends of those, the end consequences of those actions. Because a lot of people have put themselves in God's place to make those same decisions, right? Like, well, there's if it saves the world, there's nothing wrong with killing a couple million Jews, right? And that's the same type of thing, is you don't know what's going to happen, and you can't make those decisions. Then the mandate comes from God. That's a different story completely. That's essentially Romans 9. But from our perspective, we can't make those decisions, and that's something that should be mentioned in like discussing this issue with people that have an issue with that. Is I think their mental jump is, well, if it happened here, then that means you can make that justification for doing those types of things yourself, and that's not what we're saying at all, right? So that's important. I want to go through something now in this next section here. Let's kind of change some gears here. There are different lists of virtues that that the scripture offers to us, and they kind of, I think, and this is somewhat subjective and it's general, it's not really completely true, but generally speaking, I think these guidelines are I guess they're functional. But the idea is that there are different types of virtues. Now, I've kind of separated them into 4 different distinctions. Intellectual virtues, the idea of, what sort of things that you should strive for on an intellectual, mental level. And then there are moral virtues, which have more to do with, what's right and what's wrong, and the things that should come out of your actions, I suppose, and manifest to other people. And there are, I think, practical virtues, which are, I guess, has more to do with your day-to-day interactions with people and how to handle those well, which is something we should really look into, isn't it? And then there's a kind of a higher level, which kind of formulates all of them into one cohesive unit, and that would be, I would say, you could call that a spiritual virtues that kind of transcend everything, including time and space and all that sort of, the physical shackles. So I want to go through these. There are different lists in the scriptures. So let's go through them. The first one is going to be in Philippians chapter Philippians chapter 4 and verse 8. Can someone read that for me? Philippians 4:8. Anybody besides me?
I got it.
Okay.
Finally, brothers, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is commendable, if there is any excellence, if there is anything worthy of praise, think about these things.
Yeah, it's a very incredible idea. It comes from the essential teaching of Jesus on the Sermon on the Mount, which is that it doesn't just matter what you do, it also matters what goes on in your mind. Go ahead.
Well, in verse 9, not to deviate from your thought, but
Okay,
it also
go ahead.
says, practice these things.
Yeah.
Not just think about them,
Right, that's true.
but practice.
That is an important point.
Manifest them in your life.
Right, definitely.
And that's what we're talking about with the display of a virtue in your morality.
Right.
To not just, like I said, not just think, but
Right.
practice them.
Right, but to my point.
Yeah, sorry. Like I said,
You just jumped ahead of me, that's all, that's fine, yeah. I mean, we'll get there, that's true, and it is a great point. And as a matter of fact, it's right there. In that verse, connected to thinking, there is practice. And that is, an essential teaching, an essential idea. but the starting point is thinking, right? And that's the thing, is if you don't know what to do, then you can't do it. And the idea of intellectual virtue, or you might say intellectual integrity, the firmness of your mind in the pursuit of what is true and good is so important as a foundation for practicing what is true and good, you know? So if look at those particular things, whatever is honorable, whatever is pure, lovely. That's interesting too, whatever is lovely. You know, I was talking to, I don't know if this applies necessarily or not. I was talking this morning about the differences between, say, Renaissance and like your Renaissance era art and more modern art, as the realist style, as opposed to you might say impressionistic style, and some of the modern art that's come out lately. The difference seems to me essentially that the Renaissance and Greek classical art too, the goal of it was to exhibit beauty. That was the essential idea, was to find beauty. And idealism is sort of the thing which came from that as well, which still exists to this day. But mostly what we've got now is sort of, it's not really about beauty, a lot of art is now, right? If you go to, say, like a modern art museum, nothing you look there is particularly lovely to look at, right? There's a shock factor there. There's some grotesqueness to it sometimes, or there are other qualities that they're looking for in art. But initially, and really it seems to me for a long time, art, and I think because of, personally, this is sort of a side note, but I think because of the influence of the gospel in the Western world, essentially, especially, the pursuit of beauty became kind of the main, I guess, the modus operandi of art itself. That was what it was for, was to find beauty. And that, I think that's, it's not, that doesn't mean, that, I guess that the Impressionism is particularly wrong, or those other paintings are, it's not a matter of evil, but I think it's really interesting that you're supposed to think about things which are lovely, not just good and true and that sort of thing, but things that are beautiful. That's a really interesting idea that we probably neglect a lot. And I think I heard this guy, I can't remember his name, he's an Irishman, and I have his book and I haven't read it yet. It's about beauty. And I heard him on the radio. He was talking about how in the modern world, and particularly the Western world, that's where he's from, of course, that's where we live, and so that's, that type of culture is what we'll talk about. There's really not much appreciation for beauty anymore at all. It's not really a goal for us. And if you look at it, it's probably, for the most part, it's really true. We're very, in the United States especially, we're a very functional society, right? We really we think more about, I guess, the functional ability that people have and that spaces have and that sort of thing. It's not so much about beauty. And you can really see the difference in between that type of culture and what we used to be. If you go, say, like to Europe and some of the great cities of Europe, and even just to a lesser degree, some of our older cities, we are not old enough to have this. That's really the reason why America doesn't have it so much, because our cities aren't very old. If you go to the older cities of Europe, you'll see so much beauty. And that is a really interesting distinction, that the focus of beauty has kind of gone away. And I think that we've probably lost something really important by doing that. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, yes and no, because I would say if you look at the way our society is focused on environmentalism and on green spaces and on natural beauty, because what is more beautiful than what God has created? And people still have an appreciation for that. And there are people who are very passionate about the preservation of the beauty of nature. They misattribute it, but they still are very passionate about the preservation of the beauty of nature. The preservation, the prevention of the encroachment of man upon what is beautiful, which they look at in nature and they recognize is beautiful.
Right.
So I guess I would say maybe it's shifted in a little different way from what we create to what we preserve.
That's true. That is a good point. That's a good caveat to that, I guess, general rule as I see it. That and the funny thing is too, it's not a new development, particularly the environmentalism or preservationism, really, more than anything else. That's been around for a long time. I was just starting to look at this guy, this old Scottish natural philosopher called John Muir, who was I think it was like the late 1800s when he started to write. Really interesting stuff. Very creative guy too. Really amazing. And he's not, I don't think, very well known. I just saw like a quote on Facebook that I thought was really cool. It was something like, into the forest I go to lose my mind and find my soul. I was like, wow, that's awesome. And I looked up who said that and found John Muir. So anyway, but he was a preservationist. He wanted, the natural a lot of different places, and specifically California in the Northwest, to be preserved. He was one of the guys that really was heading that up. That was back in the 1800s. And this has been something that's gone on for a long time. So, and especially today, I think that probably is at least one motivation behind environmentalism for a lot of people, is the preservation of the beauty that is around us. So that is a good point. Yes.
I don't think it's that we care about beauty less now. I think we care less about the community of people and society as a whole, less than we do ourselves personally. Because I think now we're probably at the peak of caring about personal beauty and having the skill to look the best physically. I mean, and also not just what we do with our physical body in terms of fitness, but our face, our hair. And also, I think now we care more about the beauty of our home than we ever have in history. I mean, what we spend our money on.
Interesting. Okay, well, then I'm completely wrong, guys. Sorry.
If you read about how much money we spend on the beauty of our home, our pets, our kids,
Right.
ourselves.
Right. I think, if that is true, this is more of a personal opinion, so take it for what it's worth, I suppose. That it's the real issue is perhaps not really knowing maybe it's a lack of taste. If you can compare I guess the former standards of beauty and art and that sort of thing, and what we've been able to accomplish before, as opposed to what we're accomplishing regarding beauty, especially as represented in the arts now, is pretty barren now. I mean, who is today as good as a Da Vinci or a Raphael or a Michelangelo? There isn't anyone. And take poetry, for instance, beauty in words. I mean, we have a Wordsworth now or a Shakespeare. We don't have anyone. I mean, we don't care about poetry now, largely. Poetry is a pretty kind of obscure thing to get into now. Can anyone name for me a very famous poet that's alive right now? Maybe I should say seven. Seven of them. And everyone can always find one. Go ahead.
Some books, they're not written as poems, but they are written in such a beautiful way.
Right, yeah, sure.
Might qualify as
That's right.
poetry.
That's right. I guess it depends on the intent of the author. Right, definitely. Anyway, all of these things, putting together, it's sort of the idea that, well, I guess you can at least say this: beauty is an important thing. And from a Christian perspective too, maybe at least Christians don't think about beauty enough. Is that fair enough to say? That maybe we're not focusing on the lovely perhaps as much as we ought to, which is another reason why I want to do that next class, because we covered the true, now we're talking about the good. I want to talk about the beautiful, aesthetics from a Christian perspective.
Aesthetics is an interesting study, especially for, I will say, the percentage of any given object, the devotion to function versus the devotion to beauty in its creation has significantly changed since the ancient times. A building back then was supposed to be beautiful. It was something that was supposed to be attractive both inside and out. Now, a lot of our buildings are completely functional. Now, they do have their own type of almost industrial beauty to them, right? But it's not the same way. And that's why I think the study of aesthetics is worthwhile.
Definitely. But back to ethics, the starting point for virtue is in your mind, and that's the importance of thinking about these things. And the thing is, too, I thought this is really interesting. I was homeschooled, and when I think it was my senior year high school literature book was from the Abeka book company, and they had at the beginning of it was English literature, and they had this verse at the beginning of it. And it was really cool. I've never thought of it before, but apply everything you read or the things that you think about or the movies you watch, let's say, or any sort of mediums that you look at to find something, whether it be for information or just for any sort of appreciation. He says, apply this to those things. Are you thinking about through those things which are lovely and honorable? And is there any virtue in them? And it's, that's an important thing to think about, especially, like, say, our music. We always talk about that. We have for a long time. And fair enough, music and movies. Is there anything virtuous about some of those things that we're watching and listening to, the things we're putting in our mind? If there's no, say, quality, aesthetic or ethical or, I guess, epistemological quality to any of those things, then should we be putting them in our minds at all? So ethics starts in the mind. That's where it starts. You have to understand what to do and in order to do it. But to the moral virtues, the more specific ones, of course, we probably don't even need to read this one in Galatians 5:22 and 23. What are the fruits of the Spirit? Name them for me. Good job. You didn't sing it, though. No, it's okay. That's right. And these things, it seems to me, are harder to understand, right, and think about. Obviously, contemplating them is essential and important, but they're best understood when they're acted out. Love is a really hard concept to conceive of and understand, as far as I can tell. But acting it out, now, that's something that we can, that's where I guess the rubber meets the road. That's where the importance is acting them out. And these things are more than just, I guess, good things to think about. These are moral imperatives, showing love and being, peaceful, I guess, and having self-control. These are the moral virtues. But the practical ones, I want to read James 3:17. It kind of gets a little bit more to the interpersonal relationships in this case. Now, interestingly, James says that this is the true wisdom which is from above. This is like, I guess, practical wisdom, or how wisdom is manifested practically speaking in your life. James 3:17 says, the wisdom from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, open to reason, full of mercy and good fruits, impartial and sincere. Now, I like the one open to reason. Now, there's another translation. Other translations will say, what is it? Easily entreated. I like that one a lot. Easily entreated. I think a lot of Christians have a hard time getting that one through our skulls. The idea that you're not someone that's completely closed off to reason, or to other people's opinions, or to other ideas, or to other wills and things people want. Being easily entreated, someone that can say, hey, can you think about this? Yeah, I'm open to that. Open to reason. It's so important, and I think the reason we sometimes have a hard time with it is because we are taught, and rightly so, not to compromise on, say, matters of doctrine and the truth of the gospel of Christ, right? So you're not, in a sense, open to other things besides that. But that can kind of have a negative effect too if you let that go too far, to where you're not open at all. Your mind is completely closed. That's not a good thing. There's a sort of fine line that I've tried to find in my life so far, which is that I am always willing to question my fundamental assumptions. Now, that doesn't mean I don't have faith in Christ, or that I'm could turn atheist in the next minute. I don't think that's the same thing. That's not doubt in the biblical sense, I guess the double-minded man. I don't think it's the same thing. That's really not being sure, not committing yourself to something. What I'm talking about is, although you believe something, and let's say you've put your faith in Jesus, and you have devoted yourself to him and to a life in him, you still have some things about your beliefs and about your own life that aren't perfect. And you know that. Everyone does, should. And so you're always open to the possibility that you're wrong, whether it be in your ideas or in your actions. You have to be open to that, And having that means that you kind of have to have this idea that you will always be willing to question even the most fundamental things about what you believe. And I think that applies to I think that even means that you would be willing to at least think about the possibility, let's say, that maybe I've been wrong, maybe God doesn't exist. And we might say, well, no, you can't think that far. I think you have to. I think you have to be able to get to that point. I think what this means is that you're completely devoted to truth above anything else, which means above what you want to be true or what you feel must be true. Your devotion fundamentally is to truth. And that means even considering the fact that you might have been wrong about God or wrong about Christ. If you aren't that way, then how can you expect anyone else, say a Hindu or a Muslim, to be that way when you want to teach them the gospel? And I think we need to understand our interpersonal relationships this way, especially when I'm, say, evangelizing or wanting to study with someone. It shouldn't be, as far as I can tell, me being the guy who knows everything and the teacher who's trying to show you what to do and tell you what to do. I think it should be sort of an exchange, or at least you're willing to exchange and see what ideas they have, and to really not just teach them something, but learn something from them, because you can always learn something from someone else, whether it's a positive lesson or a negative one. Go ahead.
And if it doesn't stand up to that criticism, really evaluate it. Because we should be able to put this level of criticism toward anything that we believe, and we should come out with that belief system. Right. And some people are worried, they get scared when they start thinking about that. Well, I would say, if you don't have that level of confidence in the truth, why do you believe it anyway?
Right, exactly. It seems like we have maybe a little bit too much emotionally invested in some of our beliefs and ideas, because if it gets to the point where some counter idea comes up, say in the form of a popular atheist or something, and you're too scared to even listen or consider the ideas, I think maybe that you should do some, I think, self-reflection there.
And I think you do have to have a certain level of spiritual maturity to start having those ideas.
Well, sure. I mean, well, the fact is,
I'm not going to start James off with, I don't know, Hume or something like that. That's not going to be the,
right. Well, you don't, well, the idea is, well, in a sense, to train, I think, at least this is what I'll do, maybe this is wrong, but to train my children, you're sort of, to train them in the right way as regarding truth, I'll try to sort of attack what they believe and attack what I've taught them and see if they can stand up to, okay, here's why that's wrong. Now, obviously, you don't start that way. You build before you attack, right? You don't test out armor until you've kind of made the armor, right? And start beating the guy without armor on. So I think that's, that's an important caveat to all this. Go ahead.
I think this comes back to the fact that we should be Christians based upon knowledge or logic, if you will, and not feelings. If we do that, then we can look at any reason and decide is it logical or not, based on, true wisdom, not on a feeling. And that's where we get in trouble as people. We start operating on our feelings of what is right, and not our knowledge of what is right.
Right.
And in that case, because it doesn't say here to accept, open to emotion. There's reason.
That's right. And I think, was it Peter Kreeft said in a book called Socrates Meets Jesus, which is a really great book, by the way. He had Socrates, character in this case, say, the mind is opened in order that it may close on something, right? So being perpetually open, which means you don't have any beliefs, that's not the point of all this either, right? That's sort of another point, which is that the mind is open in order to close on something. But it's always willing to open again, I suppose, if new evidence is presented. And it's a matter of evidence, not emotion. Right? And yes, your hand.
Oh, and I think this has already been stated, but I've also, when you read about Christians who do fall away, their foundation is not in these concepts.
Right.
Their foundation is in what somebody told them, or
Right.
their husband, or their best friend, or then another person.
Right,
And
definitely. It's vicarious.
Their foundation has to be in these truths and these biblical, and they should be able to defend them, and they should
Right.
know them.
Right.
And that's where your faith becomes your own,
Right, definitely.
and not based on outside things.
Right. And by the way, I really don't like when people will say, there's this common attitude, it seems, that we ought to shelter our young people and keep them away from any sort of outside influence, which is obviously impossible to do. But it's like we're afraid that if they just go out into the world and talk to an atheist, let's say, they'll just become atheists. And that's, what we should be worrying about, right, is having them build their own faith and not relying on us to shelter them from the things that are out there, whether they're right or wrong. So, for instance, my cousin and her husband were going over to Italy on a mission trip, and they were talking to a church that was going to support them. And my friend, my cousin's husband, he said that he was going to try, jokingly, he said he was going to try and get a study with the Pope while he was in Italy. And the preacher got up, and of course he was kind of joking too, but it kind of illustrates the fundamental assumptions we have regarding our young people. He says, well, be careful talking to the Pope. I wouldn't want you to become a Catholic. It's like you think that the spirit, the evil spirit of Catholicism is going to spread out and grab you just because you're in close proximity to it. I think we should have more faith in the young people than that, respect them more than that, give them the tools to make something, I guess, intellectually and spiritually out of themselves instead of letting it be vicarious their entire lives. Now I saw your hand.
Chris first.
Okay, go ahead.
I was going to say, I don't think that's just an issue that the church deals with atheism or denominationalism. It's also like fear within the church. I think that's where traditionalism gets sort of bred out of. We're scared we start doing things the same way, or we get very rigid to protect ourselves even more from people within.
Definitely, yeah. The commonality here is it's all motivated by fear. right? All of these issues we're talking about are motivated by fear. That's not a good motivation for almost anything, right? I think that's an important point. You go ahead.
Well, and I think that there's this anti-intellectualism within the church. The belief that if you read a lot, know a lot of other stuff, if you explore knowledge outside the church or outside the Bible, that all of a sudden you're going to be corrupted in some way.
Instead of being confirmed.
Exactly.
Right.
And I think that people fear within the church this view of being intellectual. I think we should be the greatest intellectuals of the generation, because we should not only have the wisdom from the Word and the truth from the Word, but then we should also be able to have enough knowledge to defend it against those ideas that are outside.
Right. Yeah, I mean, the fact is, everything that exists in the world, or as what was it, Paul says in Colossians, I think it's Colossians 2:8, don't be taken captive by, among other things, the rudimentary elements or fundamental elements of the world. And philosophy was included in that as well. And that's interesting, not to be taken captive by them, as opposed to, in the next verse, being captive by Christ. And the point is that he is the culmination of all those things and the creator of them. The fundamental elements of the world, that can be basically the basic makeup of the universe, which has formed the basis for all of our studies in the sciences and all of our studies in, I guess, the humanities or the arts. Everything you could learn, possibly, about the world. Now, where's the world come from? It comes from God. So if you study the world, what do you think you're going to find? You're not going to find some endless void or Satan. You know, I guess you could if you study the world in another sense, right? With the world as an end in itself, that's a different matter. But if you study the world that God created with him as an end, what you're going to find is God. Because underneath every elementary principle, everything, God is at the beginning of them all. So we should, like you said, we should be the smartest, most intellectual people that exist. As a matter of fact, it's funny, you know, I mentioned this idea a few times that a lot of the things that are really great about our society have their foundation in Christianity and its influence on us. You know, the amount of books that we come out with, and even the development of the physical sciences never would have happened to the extent that they have if it wasn't for the Christian mindset, which goes about, really it connects to this idea of virtue, of human excellence, of trying to make something out of ourselves. There's a reason for doing it. It's not to, just survive, or not for any sort of materialistic mindset. It's so that we can, in essence, be like God, get as close to him and know as much about him as we possibly can. It's a noble sentiment. It's a noble goal. Now, I saw a hand over here, didn't I? Two hands, yeah.
I was going to say that I think in every young person at some time in their life, they question the existence of God. And when they come to you, and you really should then, that's a big opportunity. When my kids came and said stuff like that to me, I said to them, well, there's nothing wrong with that thought.
Right.
We have to, let's sit down and look about it. There's nothing wrong with that thought, and don't feel bad because you're thinking that way.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think if we're all honest at some given time in our life, before we really get ourselves, grounded and start proving things and looking at things all the time and keep learning, no matter how old you are,
Mm-hmm.
That's the one thing I would never ever with any of my kids or grandkids, if they said something like that, say to them, well, you can't think that way.
Right.
That's
Yeah.
a terrible thought.
Right.
Because
right.
it's not a terrible thought.
Right. There shouldn't be anything that we don't think we should talk about, right? Or think about, or consider under the right circumstances. In a virtuous way, you might say. There's no subject that we should be afraid to talk about. That's if there's an issue, especially, right? I mean, if there's an issue and you ignore it, the issue only grows. It doesn't go away just because you ignore it. You might think it's gone because you're not conscious of it, but it's still there, and it's going to get worse.
And you may not then have the opportunity to talk to them about other things then.
Right. Right.
Depending upon how you address certain things, you have to sit down and be willing to not only talk to them, but to listen to what they're saying. I think that is important, to listen.
Mm-hmm.
To be a good conversationist, you have to listen.
Right. And to your other point too about like questioning things and the fact that applies to us too. And the funny thing is that I had a woman talk to me some time ago at church in Maple and in Wapaka. She was really ashamed. She went to another church. They were very, very strict on a lot of things, and she was too afraid to talk to any of them about her doubts regarding faith. And the reason is because you kind of have this culture that often comes up to where you're supposed to, we're God's people, so we're supposed to have everything down, right? I know what I believe, I know why I believe it, I've got everything down, I don't really make mistakes. And so showing that you have doubts is a sign of weakness, and that is sort of seen as a threat to the group. And so and that's a really, really bad environment to create, right? Because the fact is, this is what I told her, I'm in a sense at least in where we are, no elders, it's just, I'm the minister, and a lot of all the eyes are usually on me, right? And that's sort of a lot of responsibility. The fact is I have doubts sometimes about a lot of things too. I have a lot of doubts because I try to look into things and expand my horizons on what I know and what I understand. And when you do that, you'll go through doubts. Believe me, that is what is going to happen. Because if you look at something honestly, if you can find yourself to do that as much as it's possible, you're going to have doubts. Everyone does. So, to say, oh no, that can't happen is a complete denial of the human condition, for one. And it's really unproductive for the health of the church, secondly. So those are really good points. Thank you. And were you having your hand up for her, or did you have a comment?
Yeah, and what I understand about, especially about young kids being born, they're learning everything and they're walking, and there's a point in their life is when they gotta turn and renew their mind.
Right.
And God's word is the only thing that can do it. And growing up in a strong church, each child's going to have that same point in their life.
Right.
It's just like we're still learning as being Christians, because I believe I was way out there before I turned around.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And a lot you had to renew your mind and change get rid of your bad habits and everything.
Right,
so.
Right. And, I guess to sum up all of these comments and ideas is that the moral, ethical development of a Christian, someone who's pursuing virtue, it is a process, an ongoing process that doesn't have an end in this life. And I want to read one more verse which has sort of the spiritual virtues aspect to it right before we close, which is 2 Peter chapter 1, verses 5 through 7. And this really shows the process pretty well. It illustrates it very well. 2 Peter 1, and I'll read verses 5 through 7. It says, for this very reason, make every effort to supplement your faith with virtue, and virtue with knowledge, and knowledge with self-control, and self-control with steadfastness, and steadfastness with godliness, and godliness with brotherly affection, and brotherly affection with love. For if these qualities are yours and are increasing, that's present tense, they are increasing, they keep you from being ineffective or unfruitful in the knowledge of our Lord Jesus Christ. So that kind of comes full circle too to the intellectual virtues, your knowledge of Jesus, what you decide you're going to, the qualities you'll have in your learning and your intellectual integrity, leading you to practice, leading you to developing those things in your life. An interesting supplement, you've probably heard the etymology of the word in Greek for supplement things or add to your faith, all these other virtues. The idea essentially, you could kind of say is a putting together of, I guess if you have, it's sort of a musical / choreographic type of word. In essence, it's not, some translations will say add one to the other. And it's not so much that you start with one and once you've mastered that, you move to the other. Obviously, you don't master any of them. But the idea is that you kind of choreograph them together. You're sort of making a beautiful life. You're making, in a sense, a symphony. You're supplementing them like you'd supplement certain elements inside of a musical composition. That's the idea. But it is a process. It's something that begins but doesn't have an end, essentially, not in this life. Now, there's one thing, I mentioned these, and obviously, now I did mention that I wanted to get to a specific case. Obviously, we don't have time to do that, but we talked about some other specific ones, which was really, I'm glad. Those were things that just kind of came up and we talked about, so that's fine. And that's the thing about virtue, is it's such a huge study, because there are so many different aspects of virtue. Obviously, we've read 4 different lists of virtues, and you could talk about each one of those for years, But something I always do is I read through those verses a lot. And when I pray, I kind of look at those verses a lot and ask God to help me to obtain those particular virtues and make them a part of my life. And there's one thing I wanted to mention, since we're kind of to wrap up this discussion on virtue. Now, take this idea for what you will. I think to some degree this can have depending on your personality, I think this can have a negative effect. But it's really been good for me for the most part, I mean. Benjamin Franklin had this chart that he made the different virtues. He took virtues that kind of, I guess, covered every area of life. Not all of them were necessarily like moral. Like he had cleanliness in there. Obviously, you don't go to hell for not making your bed in the morning. But he had that in there, and that covered a lot of areas of his life. And I really loved the type of system he had, was he kind of kept track of his own moral progress, essentially. And what he would do, and I do this too, is you have the virtues kind of lined up, and a lot of times I would put in some of the ones that we just read instead of those things, or in addition to them, you know. And think about, you have the virtues down on, say, on one column, and then you have the days of the week on the other, and you have squares for each one, and so you can kind of each day, like when you're doing your, say, devotional reading or something like that, you can look through these and, you know, and think about them. And when you realize throughout the day that you've done something, say, that wasn't particularly just, or say moderate, or wasn't particularly sincere, or wasn't very humble, you can kind of put a mark there and think, you know, kind of a reminder of, you know, I'm supposed to be acting this way. And of course, at first, it's kind of discouraging, because at the end of the week, you look back and you might see a lot of marks. And if you keep doing it too, it's a really interesting way to keep track of, you know, this is assuming you can be pretty objective as far as when you make mistakes, which isn't always the case. But I think it's a good endeavor to at least find some way, and this is the way I do it, to keep track of your own moral development, you know, because the idea is that you're supposed to be getting better as you get older. And, you know, I think being conscious of and aware of these things as much as you can is what will get us to that point that we are getting better. Because sometimes I find, especially from keeping these for a long time, you look at certain periods and you're like, I think I'm getting worse. And, you know, that's an important realization. It's important to think about those things and to try to get better and keep track of that progress. Now, like I said, some people won't like that particular method because it is kind of legalistic, right? It's kind of like, okay, a checklist. I mean, it actually is a checklist. We don't like checklists, you know, but I think, you know, depending on your personality, that might be a good way to kind of center your thoughts on the actions that you commit every day. Practical aspect of it.
Just a quick thing, that thought, I had Christians, because I had that thought too on how to improve yourself, but some Christians would say, yeah, you're just trying to work your way to heaven. And that's the wrong attitude to take towards that way.
Definitely. What we're trying to do is we're trying to be like God. It's a matter of trying to be, there's a divine potential inside of us, essentially, right? And we're trying to fulfill it. We're trying to make it true in our lives. Insofar as we do anything which exhibits the power or the wisdom or the goodness of God, we're trying to be like him, and we're doing what's good. We're following after virtue, and that is specifically the goal and the purpose of mankind. Yeah, that's a good way to end. All right, thank you, guys.